Myq Kaplan, welcome to the Plant Yourself podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you sound just like yourself.
That makes sense. I've been working on it for a while.
So I wanted to talk to you for a couple of reasons. One is you are my and my daughter's one of our favorite comics.
Thank you.
So I'm working on, not doing too much of the fanboy vibe here.
Oh, sure. You're doing great.
And the second is you have written and you talk about veganism and plant-based and reducetarian living, and you do it in a really elegant, funny way. Just like in our world, like most people that I know get their news from Trevor Noah and Colbert and Seth Meyers. It's like there's ways in which speaking comically can get through to people, whereas preaching doesn't. So I kind of wanted to chat with you about the intersections of all that work.
Sure, I appreciate it. Your words are very kind. A thing that I read recently, or that my girlfriend read and I reread, is this book by George Saunders, The Brain Dead Megaphone, and it's nonfiction. Like sort of humorous, like socio-political, philosophical, like just beautiful artistic essays about art and life. And one of the things he says about comedy is that it's his definition of it, or one definition of it, is something like, what is it? It's getting the truth delivered quicker than you thought, or quicker than you expected. And so I think the way that like a lot of comedians have always been, speaking truths about society, or about the ills of the world, the challenges that we face, that hopefully by naming them help identify the problems, and then they can be worked on. Like sometimes, like personally, sometimes like naming a problem is all that you need to do. A friend and I call this Rumpelstiltskinning. You name the problem, name the villain, and then the villain's power goes away. Like if you're like, why am I feeling this way? And you're like, oh, it's this sadness, it's this anxiety, this depressing aspect of my experience, that if you're, for myself, like if I'm ignoring it, or if I'm like, I shouldn't be feeling that way, then sometimes that can compound it and make it worse. So I think that sometimes being able to laugh at ourselves, laugh at our predicaments, like that's a good place to start, knowing that we're flawed, and hopefully working to improve ourselves, improve the world. And then from ourselves, I mean, for myself, like, becoming vegan, once I sort of, learned, there's like always a disconnect between like, well, this is just how it is. This is how you grow up. You don't have control over things. Like when you're a baby, a child, then you get more and more potential autonomy. And you're like, oh, the way things are needn't be the way things always have to be, because that literally things are changing all the time. And like society today is different than it was in the past. Individual life is different today than it was in the past. And so humor, certainly, like there's a long lineage of comedians using it to, I don't know if certainly it's not everyone's goal to change everything for the better, but sometimes it's just identifying things that are glaring problems. And I think the skill that a lot of comedians have is to be like, hey, this doesn't make sense. Like why,
Right.
why is it, whether it's, hey, in this country they eat these animals, but they don't eat these animals. In this country they eat these ones, but they don't eat these ones. Like, isn't it weird? Like, why is a pig different than a dog, different than a cow, different than a chimp, different than a human? Like, and certainly the answer seems to me like, well, who's right? Who's right to eat what animals? Like, I think, why don't we just not eat any of them while we figure out, so yeah,
Right.
so
And so that's, like a hilarious way of getting to sort of a precautionary principle, which people talk about sort of very seriously and academically. And, I remember taking like a 6-week class on, doing stand up. And the first prompt they gave us, like, how did we come up with material? And it's like, just start with, you know what's weird, you know what's crazy, you know? And like, as soon as like they gave us that prompt, it's like, oh, like everywhere I look, everything's weird and crazy.
Oh yeah. I mean, the way to get started on any kind of comedy, like writing, art, music, creation of any kind is like what are you noticing? Like with comedy, I think sometimes people ask the way that people ask questions when they are not comedians. They're like, "Oh, do you have to change your material? Like when you go to different geographic locations, do you change your material depending on like the age of the audience or the demographics?" And like those aren't necessarily like those aren't silly questions, but they miss something in that all comedy starts from within. Like most comedians start from like what is noteworthy, interesting, like something that either bothers them or something that you notice. What is in your experience? Like there's the whole world that you can, observe and take in and make, hypotheses about. And then also the comedian often turns like inward and be like, oh, what do I notice about myself? Because also our observations about everything in the outside world, like we can't escape, the filter of our own perspective. So that is, self-analysis is often a necessary part of comedy and also of life as well. If we're like, why don't people do the right thing? What can we do to make everyone, and like, we literally can't like physically force people to do things. We can only do things ourselves and with our, thoughts and actions and words, hopefully live by example and present, convincing, valuable pieces of information and knowledge and be like, hey, if you do like this is pretty good. Like, I mean, for veganism, it's sort of mind-boggling that there's people do it for so many reasons now. Like I started doing it because I learned how animals were being treated, the ethics of it. And then there's people today who are like also on a larger scale ethics of, the survival of so much life on the planet, human life, the environment, climate change. Like it's sort of like, do you know the trolley problem? I've been working on a joke about this sort of philosophical concept, like, the trolley's heading towards.
Oh, right. Who does it kill? Whether it kills people sort of proactively or
passively.
Passively.
Yeah. Yeah. So like if the trolley is heading for 5 people and you can switch the track and make it only kill one person, you are choosing to actively kill one person, but if you didn't do anything, it would passively kill 5 people. But the way that I feel like climate change is and that how veganism can help fight it, it's basically like animals and humans are on the same track, and we're like, hey, do we want to just move it to the track where it doesn't hit anyone, where it doesn't hit any animals or humans? And they're like, I don't know, I kind of just like, I'm lazy and don't want, whatever the, like, we're all used to the status, like, it's just what is, it's just how it's been. But then obviously it helps human health, it helps animal health, it helps the mass, the human race's health. So I guess, I mean, I hope that's the answer. Everybody's watching and just do it. And we'll be, but we can't, we can only do it ourselves and then offer it in ways that, I guess that's to sort of speak to, I think, a question that you asked, like the way that I've been doing comedy about veganism. And it's not all that I talk about, but since it's a part of my life, it's something that comes up. And when I think new things about it, I like sharing them. But for the past, decade or almost 2 decades, I've been vegan, vegetarian, some combination. I think I've been vegan for like 17 or 18 years now. And I've been a comedian about that time. So I've always been doing it and writing about it. And I've also been aware that most people aren't vegan or vegetarian. And so most of my audiences aren't vegan or vegetarian. So I feel like yelling what I think is true is not going to be effective as either comedy or activism. And so it has been valuable for me to know, like, oh, well, this is where people are and this is where I am. And I'm presenting where I am as truthfully and hopefully thoughtfully and humorously as I can to have people receive it as comedy and receive it as truth.
Right. And I mean, one thing I didn't realize that I wanted to talk to you about until just now is like the link between being a comedian and becoming a vegan, or being thinking comedically about the world, whether you're a professional or not. I think there's people who just by their nature think that way, like what's weird, what's strange, what doesn't make sense. And like I think your skill set kind of provides a blueprint for vegans to, or like for anyone who wants to make a difference in the world in a positive way, and then finds that they're in opposition to all these entrenched forces. Like like the first bit I heard of yours was about the cheese baby.
Ah, gotcha.
And it's like, right, you're like vegans can get very upset now as we look at the world around us and see, our kin being tortured and slaughtered, and yet you had a way of kind of declawing it to the point where you could present it to people, and then the claws can come back in. They can let the claws in themselves. Can you talk about like that bit and how it?
Great. I appreciate the kind words you're saying. I have to admit sincerely that bit is from so long in the past that I don't actually have it fully in my my current memory. So if you want to paraphrase it briefly, I would be grateful.
I should have my daughter on the line. She's got an auditory memory of everything. But I mean, basically, you're saying you're making fun of people who are like, yeah, but cheese, right? Like, oh, but the trolley won't kill anyone, but I can't have cheese anymore. And
okay, so
it's like, would you eat a baby if it?
Oh yeah, if it was delicious, yeah. I mean, thank you. Yeah, that makes essentially like there is great like the world is full of there is logic and there is illogic, and we are all capable of. I think when we see things that we're like, this doesn't make sense. Sometimes we're like, well, what can you do? Like sometimes people say, what can you do? As though the answer is nothing. And what can you do? Just try and make things a little better yourself, even though it's just a drop in the bucket of the ocean, that if everyone does that, then maybe the ocean will be a little purer and less full of whatever the tortured thing is. I think that there's so many people who are not vegetarian or vegan that are intellectually aware of the harm that is being caused in the system, and they don't want to think about it. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to know about it because it's rightly a sensitive area. It makes sense that people are like, oh, I don't want to think about torture. I don't want to know about this unnecessary suffering that is being caused. Even they're like, I know about it, but now that I know about it, like I don't want to think about it because like, what can I do? Especially because like I heard recently a story that the Dalai Lama went, I believe, to Auschwitz and like was on his knees praying, and somebody asked him like, what were you praying for, or what were you praying about? And he said, I'm praying that I never contribute to something like this. Not just that it doesn't happen, but that he is not a part of it. And I'm not trying to, there's a difference between, I think, in our culture today, the concepts of calling out versus calling in. Whereas if you're calling someone out, it's not likely to be effective because it's making people feel maybe perhaps like insecure or put upon or attacked. As opposed to like if you're like, you're doing this and I'm not doing this, but calling in to be like, hey, like we're all potential, and I might be misinterpreting the phrase in some ways, but my understanding is like, hey, we're all like here trying to do our best trying to do what, live in the world, to, take care of ourselves, our family, our chosen family, our larger family, our community, our society, our world, like all beings that we think are worth caring for, which hopefully is as close to all beings as possible that have consciousness and the capacity to experience pleasure and pain. And so there is a disconnect for people, because societally speaking, in the last hundreds of years, with the technology advancing to the point that there's such a removal between, even the name of the animal. Like, I have a friend who says, like, oh, do you eat chickens? Even just as opposed to, do you eat, this mass? Because even chicken is one of the only meats that the animal and the meat name is the same. Like, as opposed to cow and beef, or sheep and mutton, or deer and venison, or pig and pork. It's like chicken and chicken, but chicken has become like a mass noun name. Chicken, they're like, oh yeah, it's just stuff. Chicken is just, it's material. It's not, a living being or a dead being. But so saying, do you eat chickens, sort of forces the cognitive dissonance to activate and be like, oh, like, these are chickens. And so I think, so I can understand, because I also, like, for years, like, ate meat and there are still ways in which I'm sure I am not doing everything that I can to make, my life and the world as better a place as possible, because I am also still a flawed human being. And so I feel like we, if you are, it's all we, but if you are a person who has come along the part of the path where you're like, I, want to cause as little harm as possible, and veganism is a way that I'm doing that, and we can hopefully empathize with the parts of ourselves that weren't at that point the whole time, and other people who are at those points now. And so the idea that, the question that you asked about, offering the joke, offering something that is, like, logically sound, like, and true, that if we like to think of ourselves as right, I think all people like to think of ourselves as, like, logical and doing things because we have thought about them and can justify them and care about the reasons. When there's a joke I heard a long time ago by a comedian that was like, I know that eating animals is wrong, I just don't care that it's wrong. And that, I think, encapsulated kind of like in a Zen koan-like way what I think so many people are experiencing. They're like, yeah, like, the intellectual content of it makes sense, but I don't have to think about it unless I'm made to watch a movie or read a book or, like, engage with the information. And so the joke perhaps is like a sneaky way of doing that, being like, just a harmless joke. What can a joke? What can words hurt? What can words hurt? But the words aren't hurting. The words are actually, potentially, infiltrating into the person's, system and psyche. Like, I'm not like, comedians are master manipulators. That's what I'm saying. It's not like what I set out to say, but I guess it is, that the joke gets in there, and you're like, oh, just a soft animal paw, and then there are the claws of the reality, which are that there is suffering, and what can we do? We can do something, and so it's good for people to feel discomfort sometimes, but if you lead with discomfort, they might run away.
Right. And I think one of the things that you do, and I think a lot of comedians do this, is, of course, you're turning the spotlight on yourself and you're pointing out your own hypocrisies and the ironies. So just like, I think eating animals is wrong, but I don't care that it's wrong. That you're going first in a way, which undercuts all of the problems of being right and righteous, right? Like, nobody wants to be the asshole, right? So if you go first, you're kind of giving permission for other people to say, yeah, I also have things inside that I could look at a little closer.
Yes. And so the idea that, I think anyone who is an asshole in any way is that way because someone was an asshole to them, whether it was, a peer, an authoritative structure, society, their family, their parents, like whatever or whoever it was, like. And so the idea that I feel like so many of us think that if somebody's like, you're being an asshole, like, well, you're being an asshole, and it's just asshole, asshole, like in an infinite mirror reflecting back and forth. And at a certain point, you're both right. And that's not necessarily the most constructive or productive, but it's understandable because we're like, well, this is what happened to me, and so that's why I am the way that I am. And so the past makes sense, but also doesn't necessarily mandate or justify or require a certain future. And in fact, again, being empathetic to, oh yeah, our child self who was not treated perfectly, our current self who's not treated perfectly, any being that's not treated perfectly, like, why don't we want everyone? It would be best if everyone was treated quote unquote perfectly, or as close to perfectly is. But yes, by saying, okay, yeah, I'm an asshole sometimes, I don't do the right things all the time. And so if that can't be, it doesn't make sense for that to be the end of the conversation. If somebody's like, oh, okay, so you're an asshole sometimes, you're a hypocrite sometimes, I'm an asshole sometimes, I'm a hypocrite sometimes, great, we're just all hypocritical assholes, and let's just leave it there. Like, it would make sense to be like, okay, well then why don't we all work on what we can do ourselves individually and working together collectively to hopefully be less hypocritical and less assholes. And so that's like the aspect of calling in, which is like, yeah, let's like we are in this life, reality, universe, world, circumstances together. We're here, and we can be assholes, and we can try not to be.
Right. And I think, I believe that most people's impulses are to be as good as they can. And one of the ways in which we kind of reinforce people's assholeness is by calling them out. Right.
Yes.
Right. So that and again, comedy is like, I think there's something, I haven't really studied this, I do a lot of body work and work with people around health, but I haven't really studied the physiology of laughter. But I suspect that there are things going on when we are laughing, or laughing in a certain way, that maybe turns off some of the asshole circuits.
That could be. I think so. There's a scientist named Peter McGraw who has done some work. I think he and maybe fellow researchers have put out a book called The Humor Code, and they are researching humor and comedy and laughter and what makes these things arise scientifically. And one of their theories, or the main theory that I remember from them, is called benign violation. That that maybe goes back evolutionarily to, like, if we heard a rustling in the bushes and were worried that it was a saber-toothed tiger, and so we get scared, we're fearful of our own death, and then the bushes part and our friend comes out, and we're like, oh, it wasn't a tiger, it was my friend. Oh, that's, like, in a way, maybe not funny, but that's where, like, nervous laughter can be released, because it was like, it seemed like it could have been a violation, but it turned out to be benign, which is the same kind of thing that jokes can do. Like, jokes can present, like, hard satirical, like, truths about difficult topics, but delivered with a smile, with sort of, a Zen koan, like, yin yang of suffering and joy in the same moment, like a bittersweet flavor of, like, oh God, like that, it's painful, but it's joyful. And so I think that being an asshole, like, being angry, being aggressive, that comes from a similar place of fear. That comes from wanting to protect ourselves, of being insecure, like, and that, so the same kind of fear that you worry about whether there's a tiger in the bush. And so laughter is a thing that I think exemplifies the lack of fear, the calming that moment where, and so I can't speak to exactly like the causality versus the correlation of it, but the same way that they say, like, if you're not feeling happy but you smile, then just the act of smiling, your brain is like, oh, we're smiling, so that must mean we're happy a little bit.
Hmm.
So you actually do become happier, and perhaps with laughing, the same thing is that your brain's like, oh, we're laughing. Okay, we're safe, we're calm, we don't need to be a jerk, we're okay.
Right. And that's so fascinating because so much of the work I do with people is their fight or flight response has been sort of locked in somehow. And so people are trying to eat healthier, but they're constantly stressed out. Like they don't have control. And so we do a lot of work on the neurology to kind of get people to learn how to relax. And so I think, if laughter, like if you think it's a saber-toothed tiger, you're going to, and you're trapped, you're going to attack it. And so the laughter might be the physiological, just like you said, the think quicker, the truth quicker than you expected. The laughter can get you to, oh, it's friend, therefore I'm going to down regulate so I can be appropriate.
Oh yeah, I mean, and I think we could all also relate to the idea, like, sometimes like a friend might jump out at us to fake surprise, fun, scare us, but and sometimes you might be actually like, scared and mad, and you might be like, hey, like, don't do that. And so then the question of like, intent in all these things, like whether, and even somebody steps on your foot on the train and you get angry at them even though you're not, like they didn't intend that. But you're still in pain, you still feel fear, you still feel aggrieved. Like there's a, do Ram Dass?
Mm-hmm.
Ram Dass told a story once. Oh yes. He was talking once about, there was a man in a boat floating, rowing through a great fog, and then through the fog, all of a sudden another boat just slams into his boat. And he's like, hey, he reacts with anger. And then the fog lifts briefly and he sees that there's actually nobody in that boat. It was just a freely floating boat. And so he's like, who is this anger? Like, where is it? Like, it's only in him and it's not at anyone. And that's kind of like, what the world is like sometimes. Like, even when it is somebody, even if somebody is endeavoring to do us harm, that's, again, because of their circumstances, because they were harmed. And we can understand that, like, unless you are, let's say a sociopath, a psychopath, like a sadist who wants to cause pain just for the sake of causing pain, which is not most people. I think scientifically, statistically, I agree with you that most people, like, are reasonable and would want everyone to, if possible, to experience more pleasure than pain, no unnecessary pain. And so if that is our ideal, if that is our, philosophy, then how do we apply it? Which is a thing that I've only like been explicitly thinking about recently, in the past few years, of like actively know, like, you can know the slogans of how to behave and how to live and how to treat people and how to, forgive and be compassionate. And then also, applying those things is different than knowing them. Like, because sometimes people are like, like, imagine like when you're a kid and you're like talking, quiet, whispering to your friends, and a teacher shushes you louder than you were talking. Like, I remember, I feel like and we all do things like that. We all have these like humorous hypocrisies within us that we can start from ourselves and then hopefully use that as, bait to draw other people into, hopefully improving themselves and the lot of any beings that they interact with.
Right, and it's such a generative place to come from if you're looking to, call in and change hearts and minds. I was a school teacher in the 1980s, which means that I had a terrible relationship with a photocopier. And we would get mad at the photocopier like it was a bad person.
Ha.
And what I eventually learned from that was that most broken people are photocopiers. Like they're just like kicking them, getting mad at them doesn't help, and they can't help what they're doing. But there's maybe some ways in which my friendship can, and my understanding, my kindness can help. And I think for a lot of vegans, especially, it's so easy to look out in the world, or environmentalists, or trans activists, or anti-homophobic, like anyone who's looking and seeing so much cruelty and pain, and so much that looks premeditated and systemic. I think it's a really important antidote for us to constantly be thinking of people like they're not doing they're doing the best they can somehow.
I like the idea, the analogy of the person as the photocopier, because in ways, we have received genetic code and, environmental nurturing, like, or non-nurturing, whatever environment, whatever factors went into us, like that's what we create. I know this isn't the exact meaning of like as above, below, but we receive and then things flow through us, and it's not to say that there's no on a certain level, personal responsibility, but yeah, of course we can, if we're dealing with a photocopier or the photocopier of a person. Like the good news about a human photocopier is that we do grow and change in ways that being friendly to a human is more effective. Being understanding and empathetic and caring and compassionate and understanding where the photocopier human came from is going to be more effective than being like, oh, nice photocopier, please be friendly to me. Like, you've heard the thing, I'm sure, holding a grudge is like taking poison and waiting for the other person to die. That's a famous thing that I don't know what, like, the original source, but the addendum that I have added to it is and forgiving people or being compassionate, being understanding, being empathetic, like that is like taking vitamins and hoping that other people improve. And it can also, like, both of those things, like it can be effective. Like the more you care for yourself, like the better able you are to care for others. The more you care for others, like hopefully there's this equilibrium that floats back and forth, this pendulum that swings. Like it's important to do both. It's important to care like for yourself, but not only yourself. It's important to care for others, but not forget yourself. Like, because we are all hopefully in this together, establishing an ideal personal and societal and in all ways equilibrium.
Right. So I have some questions about like your craft, or
Sure.
as it connects to activism. So do you, I mean, I assume you want to be funny first, right? So do you ever feel like tension between like the point I want to make and getting the audience reaction or being as funny as possible?
That's a good question. I will answer it in a very probably long and roundabout way. But when I started doing comedy, I didn't know how to do it, which makes sense. You don't know really how to do anything until you're doing it.
Roughly,
even like
how old were you at this point? Like high school?
24.
Okay.
24.
Okay.
Like I taught myself guitar in high school. I'd been playing the violin my whole life. My parents were music teachers. Playing songs, writing songs which I started around maybe age 15, 16. That was like the first time that I came online. I was like, oh, this is like, this creative spark is the thing that I want to foster, that I want to flourish. And so I didn't know at the time like how it would manifest, but I eventually was writing funny songs like in my teens and in college. And then I started performing at all places around Boston where I was in school, like mostly music venues, but one comedy club that I played my funny songs at, and in between the songs I would talk. And that is what made me realize that I also and then overwhelmingly wanted to do comedy. But even then, knowing that that's what I wanted to do, like the same way I learned to juggle in high school, And I learned it actually in a public speaking class where everyone had to present a how-to talk in 5 minutes. So one student, this girl Christine, she was like, "Here's how you juggle," and she demonstrated it and spoke through the steps of it, which was basically like you start with one, you throw it till it's right in front of your face, and you catch it. You just keep doing that until you can do that, without even looking at your hands. You just one ball back and forth. And then you do two balls, and then you start with one in each hand, and when one's in front of your face, in front of your forehead, in front of your eyes, then you throw the other one, and then you catch them both, and then you just keep doing that until you can do that, and then that's all you do with three, and then you keep going. And I retained that. It was so simple, but so I knew how to do it intellectually, but until I started actively doing it, it's like knowing the slogan and applying the slogan. I started applying the slogans, and I was like, oh, eventually I could do it, and now I can juggle. And so with comedy, I understood that the throwing of the balls was going out in front of audiences and saying things, of like writing things down at home, of coming up with ideas and going on stage and expressing them and being like, is this a joke? In the beginning, more asking jokes than telling jokes. And so at that point, and I think that, and this is different for everyone, like there's so many comedians who are doing wonderful, like political comedy, like social justice work in comedy, their own, like Maria Bamford talking about her own struggles with mental health, mental illness, which is, paving the way for, like, it's an in for so many, I feel like, people who are marginalized to be seen and feel heard. And like Aparna Nancherla and Hari Kondabolu and W. Kamau Bell, like there's so many people who are doing this great work. And I don't know if maybe when they started, they were like, I'm going to talk about these important things no matter what. Like, I do think that the goal, so the question of whether it's funny first is kind of like, it's a chicken egg thing, so to speak. I think that's an okay expression, because in this, the chicken and egg are living and birthing and continuing a process of life unimpeded by humans or farms. But
yeah, it's better than the tofu and the soybean.
Yeah. So for myself, I started by telling jokes about anything. Like sometimes they were like anything that came to me, because I didn't know if anything would be funny, so I just tried everything. Some jokes about my personal life, some jokes that were just silly observations, some things about just words and the structure of language, some things about social justice, some things about veganism, some things about movies and pop culture. Just my whole life experience was like, put into the wood chipper, the idea chipper. My friend Zach Sherwin and I sometimes call it the word chipper. And then it comes out and we're like, is this funny? Is this good? Is this worthwhile comedic art? And in the beginning, like if you listen to, my first album that came out 10 years ago or so, like there's jokes of all kinds. Like some jokes are about vegetarianism and veganism. Some jokes are about homophobia and racism. Some jokes are just about silly things that don't matter, or don't matter in the same way that those other topics are meaningful to the way that I want to express things in the world. I mean, sometimes just being funny for funny's sake, like without regard to what the topic is or a goal or aim to change anything, like sometimes that is valuable of itself in a moment to help connect with humans and make with other humans. I'm also human, and inspire joy, just joy in a moment. And moving forward, as I did comedy for years and years, I learned that not that I could make anything funny to any person, but I learned that that's more true than not. Like Emo Phillips is a wonderful comedian who I heard in an interview once say, like when somebody asked him, do you think you're better at writing jokes now? And he said, I think I'm actually the same at writing jokes, but I'm better at assessing which jokes are going to be the ones that are the funniest and most successful. And maybe that's true, but also maybe he was getting better, and so any of the jokes that he chose would have been the best. But so for myself, I now, in the last couple hours of comedy that I've created, I have done so with more purpose. Like I still create any idea that I think could be funny. A funny thing happens, I say a funny thing, like I see a funny sign, like it doesn't have to be about activism or social justice. I write it down, I record it, I'll try I have so many more ideas now. Like for every like I probably have 1,000 ideas for every like 10 ideas I try on stage. Maybe that's not the number, but I just the churning of the mind, the openness to the world and possibility of what could be shared as a joke idea, like that is so plentiful compared to the 1, 2, 3 times I might get on stage in a night, or the hours if however long I'm doing. Like some of it's dedicated to planting seeds of new ideas and growing them. And like I read this thing in a Thich Nhat Hanh book about, I think the book was maybe it was either how to fight or how to love. And it was about how when we feel challenged, when we feel anger, we can water the seeds of anger and then that's what will grow. Or we can water the seeds of compassion for ourselves, for others, for that moment. And then the seeds of compassion, whatever seeds you water will grow. And I realize that is so for my comedy as well. Like if I spend a certain amount of time writing every day, thinking every day, meditating on ideas every day, if like I can't force any jokes to arise, I can't make myself have an idea. But if I start writing about, gay rights or trans rights or, animal rights, the more I have my mind thinking in that direction, then I think the more flowers will blossom, the more that plant will rise from the soil and grow, and then I can prune it and shape it into the show, the joke, the idea, the art, the comedy that I want it to be. So it's a cyclical process that, I think like nature itself continues to, feed, the water from the ocean, evaporates to the clouds, rains down, and hopefully by, aiming myself, by orienting myself towards and focusing on the ideas that I want to, it's like a confluence. It's not that I have to choose between being funny and, saying the things that I want to say. Like I want to do both and I get to do both. And like, if I had it, like there definitely are ideas that I've had where I'm like, this is a good concept that I want to express and I need to make it funny or else I can't do it as comedy. I could, write it as an essay. I could have it be a poem or a song. But if it isn't a certain level of funny, and I mean, and these are all guidelines. Like if you watch George Carlin, one of the people who's like cited as like one of the most influential comedians, one of the funniest comedians. Like if you look at any special of his, an hour and a half, a 90-minute special, like there might be chunks of it that he's going without laughter because he's saying something that is meaningful and poetic and artistic. Maybe it is more poem or spoken word in that moment, and it's part of. And so that is an inspiration as well. Like he is being himself, doing the things that he wants to do, saying the important things and getting the laughs that he wants to, often at the same time, but sometimes one at a time. And so if I'm doing comedy, like certainly the goal is to be on average as funny as possible. And also as a human being, my goal is to on average be, doing the best work, being my best self, the best I can. And my work as a human and comedian is to bring those two in as close a confluence as I can.
So one question that just came to me is you've cited Thich Nhat Hanh and Ram Dass. I became what I thought was funny in junior high to stop people from teasing me. And so,
Sure.
So my comedy was very much, pull out the sword, wave it around, put it back in, and, sit down with a self-satisfied grin. Like it was very defensive. I know from studying comedians that a lot of comedians come from very troubled backgrounds, and it's like they're working on their own shit and stuff like that. And I'm getting the impression that you're approaching, you've been talked a lot about positivity. In the essay you wrote for the Reducetarian Solution, you talk about like the very first thing is, why are we worried about what's not on our plate? Like, let's just be happy with what is. You're working really hard on yourself in a very sort of positive way. And I'm curious whether, when you started in comedy, whether I'm not even sure exactly what the question is, but like, how come you're not this troubled, drug addict?
Sure.
I don't know. I'm trying to get to something here. Like, you chose something in addition to comedy to water in your life.
Yeah, I can speak to that. First, thank you. First a question, is that sword analogy, like pulling out the sword, waving it around and putting it back in, is that of your own creation, or is that from it's very evocative?
Who knows where I get metaphors from, but it's certainly
it's beautiful.
Actually, I think there was something like that in an essay in the Big Book of Jewish Humor.
Okay.
Which is saying that the Jewish humor is before the anti-Semites can attack you, you pull out the sword, you cut yourself, you put it back and say, try to do better than that. So that's really
interesting. I actually, on that subject, a brief interlude, I heard once years ago that there was an Iranian newspaper that held a Jewish Holocaust joke competition. They were like, send us your best Holocaust jokes. And it was not in like, a positive, loving spirit. And in response, an Israeli magazine or newspaper said, well, you're going to have a Holocaust joke competition? Well, you know what we're going to do then? We're going to have a Holocaust joke competition. So like kind of the same thing, like 8 Mile style, take yourself down as far as possible. And then nobody can, if you're lying on the ground, nobody can knock you over. And there's a quote from Harry Shearer, I believe, comedy from The Simpsons and otherwise. I think he was on Mark Maron's podcast, and I think Mark has quoted him as saying, like, people get into comedy to control for how people laugh at them or why people laugh at them. Mm-hmm. He's like, people are going to be laughing at you. So if you just, if you're laughing too, then they're laughing with you, not at you by definition. And I will say the point that you make about comedians often coming from troubled places, that is something that is certainly a commonly expressed idea. And I'm not saying that it's not true, but one time I remember someone, I think Nikki Glaser or Amy Schumer, was being interviewed about, and the question was something like, is it hard to be a woman in comedy? And they're like, it's hard to be in comedy. And that's the truth. And also, like, comedians have it difficult, but everyone has challenges. Everyone has difficulty. Like, so few people don't come from troubled places. So few people don't have challenges, don't have loss. I just read today a Buddhist story about a person named Kisa, I think, who lost a child and went to the Buddha despairing. And the Buddha said, I will bring your child back if you can go get, I think, white mustard seed from any family that has not experienced loss. And she goes around to every family, and every family has experienced loss. And so she returns and she's like, oh. And that doesn't bring her child back, but it brings her into communion with every family. Every living person is part of a family that has experienced loss. And so, sorry, I'm going off in a lot of directions, but the point is that every human being experiences some suffering. Every human being experiences some pain. Not every human being becomes a comedian, becomes an artist. Like with a comedian, you hear about it, you know about
Right.
it.
So it's sort of like selection bias.
Yeah, you don't know like about are all the plumbers well adjusted, or are they just keeping quiet about their troubles? In some ways, like if somebody is talking about their problems, like somebody like at Alcoholics Anonymous, or like, hi, my name is this and I'm an alcoholic. Like there is a problem, but there's also a solution underway, a
Mm.
process. If you're not identifying the problem, maybe there's no problem, or maybe there's double the problem, more of a problem, because you're not aware of the problem. We all have blind spots, and sometimes, like I would say that in the past, I wasn't even aware that I had all the blind spots that I now. Oh, now I'm like a little farther ahead. I'm like, oh, look at all the.
Right.
But I will also say, specific to the question about me, I mean, and also I guess this is still about everyone. Like we aren't unchanging, unmoving things. Like we might have a concept of ourselves as like, this is me, or if you're a comedian, this is my brand, or like the comedian that I am now is very different than the comedian that I was in vast ways from when I started. Like I didn't know about, Pema Chodron, Ram Dass, Thich Nhat Hanh, Brene Brown, Byron Katie. I didn't know about all of the self-help gurus, the spiritual teachers and learners that, have existed for, decades, centuries, millennia. I didn't know so much, and so I'm very grateful that I've discovered like some of these like Pete Holmes and Duncan Trussell are comedians who have been sort of gateways into your Deepak Chopras and Eckhart Tolles or Tolles. I never know. Um, and
I hear it really pisses him off when people mispronounce his name.
oh yeah, he's the maddest, and he loses it. He goes around slapping everyone. And so to go back to where I started as like a child, my parents divorced when I was about 12 or 13. Like I did come from a loving, I mean, I think a loving family. I had enough food and shelter and was cared for. My parents were teachers. They had jobs. Like I know now that there's so many people that didn't feel as safe and comfortable and supported and cared for emotionally, financially, as culturally, racially. There's so many ways in which I have been fortunate. And then also in high school, I started at a new school and I was introverted and shy and didn't know really how to do anything, like connect with people. And I just sort of kept to myself, and there were very solitary years. And, if that's an ingredient that, helped make the mix of a comedian, perhaps a comedian
Yeah.
ingredient.
Yeah.
That's a fun lyric.
But I guess what I'm like, I think I've seen, and I'm totally on the outside here, that there's ways in which when you take that energy of whatever our brokenness is and you turn it into a shtick, that it doesn't necessarily lead to healing or the same kind of introspection. Like you can, like I'm thinking about, I can't remember who it was, but it was one comedian who's like, his persona, like fat jolly guy, and just got scary health report and was feeling terrible, but found he couldn't lose weight because he didn't know who he would be as a comedian if he wasn't the fat jolly guy. Like that metaphorically for like all of our angst. It feels like you're really consciously, intentionally watering some growth that may cause you to change as a comedian, and it sounds a little scary.
I I appreciate that. I think that resonates with me, other than I don't find it scary. I mean, other than like I used to be terrified to think about, not existing. Because I'm like, I've only known existence until I realized, like, I mean, certainly I didn't exist before I did. So one of a few things is true. Either I did exist before and I just don't know it, or I didn't exist and I didn't know it. Either way, I didn't know it. And so afterwards, like after death, I'll either not exist and not know it, exist and know it, exist and not know it, or not exist and know it. That's kind of fun. That's I think actually that's probably what it is. I mean, it's these words are difficult to get at the truth, but yeah, I think after death I'll not exist and know it. And I used to be afraid when I thought about it, but that wasn't. I mean, and I'm not saying that fear has to be productive, but there are ways in which there's so many seeds planted, and I want to grow them all, but I can't. But there's an experience I had years ago where marijuana is not really my thing, but I like vaped some marijuana at a party with some friends in like a nice environment, and I don't like smoking, but the vaping went in so smoothly, and like my head got high immediately. And I felt good. And I was like, oh, this feels good. But then I immediately worried. I'm like, but what if I took too much? What if it doesn't stop there? What if it gets higher and higher and I lose my mind and I freak out? What if I freak out later? And then I was actually able in the moment to be like, well, if you're going to freak out later, then freak out later. If you're like, there's two times, if there's now and later, you can freak out now, you can freak out later, or you can do not freak out now and not freak out later. If you can control it right now, you can not freak out now. And if you're going to freak out later, deal with that then. If you freak out now, it's actually, you're freaking out, you're definitely at least freaking out once. But if you're not, so similarly with death, I'm like, okay, death is going to be whatever death is. And I used to be terrified of it. So it's either death is terrifying when it happens and now, or just like live as productively and positively and fulfillingly and addressing the ills of the world and what I can in myself and doing what I can now. Like it is something that logically makes sense to me. And I also understand if not everyone can feel that and do that immediately. But there are things like, keeping a gratitude journal, like, writing 3 things down when you wake up or when you go to sleep, like being like, what am I grateful for today? Now, what do I have? Like, if there is unhappiness, like any pain in your life will be gone when you're dead. Any like thing that you're afraid of about the future is because you're happy about what you have now. And maybe you're worried about losing it. Like, or if you're not, like, there's so many, I don't know all the things. I can't do all the iterations and all the examples, even though, and I'm like, oh no, why? I'm terrified. I got to stop. And so I guess the point is that there is in between here and death as well. There's a lot of points between here and death. And they involve our bodies and our minds, going through changes, sometimes challenging changes. Something like Ram Dass wrote a book about his aging process, about his stroke. He's talked about, in preparation for death. I think his documentary and maybe a book is called Becoming No One or Becoming Nobody. And like I understand that can be intellectually scary or maybe actually scary because the beginning of our lives is about becoming someone, becoming something, being like, this is who we are. Who are we? What do we do? Like Picasso, I think, said the first half of your life is dedicated to discovering your gift. And then the second half of your life is dedicated to giving it away. And in a way, it's like breathing in and breathing out, like existing and then not existing. And for me, it was going from a place of not understanding any of that to understanding some of it, to not having this concept at all, to having it, to even learning about the concept of watering seeds, to learning about the concept of watering seeds, or like the Native American story of the grandchild and the grandparent. And the grandparent says, inside of each person are 2 wolves. One is the angry wolf, the wolf of fear and negativity and darkness. And then the other wolf, the wolf of compassion and love and kindness. And these wolves are fighting all of the time. And the child says, who will win? Which wolf will win? And the grandparent says, whichever one you feed. So it's basically the same as the seeds. It's like, what do you feed in yourself? Like, literally, what are you feeding yourself? And metaphorically and symbolically and spiritually, and with your time and attention and focus, who are you spending time with? How are you spending your time? Like, what are you reading? What are you watching? Like, what are you engaging with? And I came from a place of wanting to do everything, wanting to do all the good things, read all the best books and watch all the best movies and, learn all the best facts and enjoy all the best sunsets and friendships, and realizing that in one human lifetime, in this manifestation, that I am, or that is me, I can't, anything that I do is a billion things that I'm not doing, but it's a thing that I'm doing. And
I'm trying not to feel guilty about all the great books you're not reading this hour.
I mean, I'm doing one at a time. I'm reading a wonderful one now by Ursula Le Guin, who I just discovered.
Oh, which one?
Called The Lathe of Heaven.
Ooh.
It's really wonderful. It's about a man whose dreams can affect reality. And I don't want to say any more than that, but also symbolically, like, all of our dreams, thoughts, actions, everything that we do literally does affect reality on at least the scale of our doing it. Whatever thought we have is now a part of reality, because our brains are a part of reality, our bodies are. So just back to the question of if anyone out there is symbolically or actually a fat comedian who has their whole act built around being the fat person, and you're worried that you won't have an act if you aren't fat, I think that's nonsense. I mean, in a way that you're a comedian, you're capable. You are not only your body, you are your mind, your brain, your thoughts. We are all a potential, like every comedian I know. I mean, there's a wonderful comedian named Ron Funches who was large and then lost a lot of weight. He is still funny, still himself, probably an even better comedian now for having had these additional experiences. Like the idea that, a person's comedy has to be or should be or even can be only one thing is fortunately nonsense. So that's the way that in my life I'm not worried about changing. Like sometimes we haven't talked about specifically a psychedelic that I have engaged with, ayahuasca, over the last 5 or 6 years, every once in a while. And it is a mind-altering and in many ways life-altering, which is in some ways the same thing, experience. And sometimes people have heard stories about it and heard that it's like the chemical in your brain, DMT, that is released when you die is what the active ingredient of ayahuasca is. And like, isn't that, is it terrifying? It can be. Is it that people ask sometimes, like, aren't you afraid that you'll do it and then you'll never be the same? And I would say, are you afraid of not doing it and never changing, never growing, never learning, never adapting, never evolving? Like, and of course it's impossible to not change. Everyone is always learning new things, having new experiences, becoming a slightly different person, materially, physically, energetically, chemically, molecularly, spiritually, emotionally, all of the time. And like the same way, here's an analogy I haven't thought of, that Harry Shearer says people get into comedy to help control for why people are laughing, to get in on it. Like, you can do that with your change as well, which if you're definitely moving forward in time, which way do you want to be facing? Where do you want to be heading? What do you want to do? Like they say, the way we spend our days is the way we spend our lives. It was just New Year's Day, and I was like, okay, what do I want to do this day? Because it's the first day of the year. It's the first day of a decade. It's the first, this is the day that sets it all in motion. and I did some things that I wanted to, and then I didn't do everything that I wanted to because I didn't have time to do everything. And so I'm like, okay, so the way we spend our weeks is the way. So the next day I did some other things. And like, we're not in trouble if we don't do everything that we can, but why don't we want to do, I mean, and we are doing everything that we can. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Right. Well, and to me, it's it's a lesson for all of us. Like we all, whether we're comics or not, we all have our identities, and they can be very comfortable places, and they can be very stultifying places. So just actually on the 13th, I have an interview with a ayahuasca shaman. So it's interesting that we're
oh yeah, that makes sense.
Predating. Well, it's plants.
Can I say? Oh yeah, of course. There's a wonderful book that I just got and read some of called When Plants Dream, about like the history and politics and like sort of social and otherwise impacts of ayahuasca. But I do also I wanted to say that, and I wanted to say other things. Oh yeah, if your identity is of value to you, which I also understand. I've been a person and still am probably in many ways whose identity is of value. Also intellectually knowing that you are changing, and if your identity involves being true to yourself and honest with yourself and understands that you're going to be taking in new experiences and, using your regrets of the past as fuel for future positive action, like have that be part of your identity. Your fixed identity can be, a person whose identity is unfixed and moving forward and changing. And the idea that if a comedian used to be a broken person, a damaged person, like the goal, the arc of a life is hopefully working on the ways that we are, damaged, broken, fixing, like the Leonard Cohen lyric that I love. I think the song Anthem. He says, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. And it's the most beautiful thing to even just like, it makes me tear up to think about it. Like everything has a crack, and that's the way light gets in, and then you can see what is there. You can then, and seeing it and naming it is and or can be a first step towards working on it and processing it and talking about it and sharing it and connecting it with others. And so I think it would be wonderful to be like, hey, comedian, you used to be all, sad and broken and talking about your identity and maybe some comedians do, like, because it's been in some ways valuable and fruitful for them, be like, I'm the angry guy, I'm the sad guy, I'm the self-deprecating guy. But I mean, personally, I used to have jokes about how I seemed like a guy that like girls, wouldn't like. And as a child, I felt like I was a guy that girls didn't like, and I didn't have a girlfriend till I was like, 16 or 17, which seemed like everyone else was doing it before then. But then, I started being a person who understood that I could, that I was of value and I could offer something and I could share something and have relationships. But then the jokes like lagged. The jokes were like, look at me. Or the jokes became about like, you probably think I'm this guy. I used to be that guy, but I'm not that guy, but you think I am. And eventually I'm like, that's not even, I don't need to water those seeds anymore. I can water the seeds of the seed watering.
Right. And I connect with that very strongly, just as someone who sees myself knee-jerk self-deprecate. Right? Like, this is like, this feels like this is an old act. And
yeah. I think that it's a valuable tool because, and there's a thing I love that I feel like I'm paraphrasing, that the Buddha has said so many different things. He has advice for so many different situations that some of the pieces of advice are conflicting. And you're like, well, how could he say this and this? Well, different people need different advice at different times. If somebody is beating themselves up all the time, like probably the advice wouldn't be, hey, you should learn how to self-deprecate. Or maybe it is actually. Or if somebody is too full of themselves, maybe they need to learn how to self-deprecate. Maybe that advice works for everybody. But If you're like too high strung, maybe you need to hear relax. If you're too relaxed, maybe you don't need to hear relax because you already know relax. Like if you've breathed in, the advice is exhale. If you've breathed out, the advice is inhale. The opposite advice can be right for different circumstances. So I think that I commend you for having the possibility to self-deprecate. If it seems like if you're in waters that are too self-laudatory, be like, oh, but who am I? You know, like there's a thing from the Talmud that says a rabbi had two pieces of paper in his pocket. One of them says, this world was created for you. The other one says, we are nothing but ash and dust. And so sometimes it's important to remember one, and sometimes it's important to remember the other, because they're both, in ways, universally true.
I love it. I love it. So before I send you off, where can people find your work, follow you, give you money?
That's very nice of you to ask. So my name is Myq Kaplan, and I spell it Myqkaplan. Myq Kaplan, spelled like that, is all of my social media. It's so that's where you can find jokes, and my website usually has links to shows. I live in New York. I do shows here a lot. I travel as much as possible. If you're somewhere that there is comedy, ask them for me to come there, and hopefully I will. I do have albums that you can listen to from anywhere. I'll have a new one coming out this year called All Killing Aside. The most recent one's called No Kidding. They're all wherever albums are. I do have a special on Amazon that you can watch called Small, Dork, and Handsome. And my podcast is called Broccoli and Ice Cream. And each week I speak to somebody about the work of their life and the joys of their life. And so one episode comes out for free wherever free podcasts are. And a bonus one is available at Patreon. For less than, it usually turns out, less than $1 an episode, like $4 a month gets you 4 or 5 episodes, hearing about the joy usually when I've talked about the work for free. Work for free, joy for money. So that's how you can give me money on my Patreon and my albums and come to see live comedy shows. And I think that's most of who I am and what I do.
Awesome. Myq, thank you so much for everything, for all the laughs you have allowed me to have, and for taking the time today, and for your advocacy for a better world.
I really appreciate it. Thank you. They say that we see the world not as it is, but as we are. So anything nice that you said about me is secretly something that is nice about yourself.
All right. And you're very handsome too.
Love it. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.